It started like any other patrol. The sun rose slowly over the jungle, casting long shadows through the trees. The soldiers of the 173rd Airborne walked in silence. They had done missions like this before. Drop in, search the area, get out. But this time something felt different. The air was still, too still. Birds didn't sing, leaves didn't move. The jungle wasn't alive, it was waiting, watching. Then it happened. Gunfire ripped through the silence. Men screamed. The ground exploded. Bullets came from every direction. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were hiding places for the enemy. The paratroopers were surrounded. Young soldiers, barely out of high school, were thrown into a nightmare. Some fought back, some prayed, others rushed to save their friends, dragging them through the dirt, holding their wounds closed with bare hands. And in the middle of it all was one man, wounded but still moving, still saving lives. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he became a legend. This was no ordinary fight. This was not just another mission. This was Operation Hump, a brutal ambush deep in the jungles of Vietnam. A day that would change lives forever. A day that tested the courage of every man who walked that ridge. If you want to hear more real stories like this, stories of forgotten battles, brave soldiers, and history that still matters, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to uncover, and we're just getting started. In 1965, Vietnam was heating up. The United States had just sent thousands of troops across the ocean. Young men from all over America, farmers, factory workers, college dropouts, now wore the same uniform. Most had never left their hometowns. Now they were landing in a place they couldn't even spell a year earlier. Among the first to arrive was the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They were proud, elite, trained to drop into battle from the sky. The Army called them the Sky Soldiers. They came to Vietnam believing they could win, believing they were stronger, better trained, and better equipped than any enemy they might face. But Vietnam wasn't what they expected. The heat was unbearable. The jungle was thick, wet, and full of insects. The trees were so tall and close together that daylight barely reached the ground. Every step felt like walking into a trap. Still, the mission came down. The 173rd would take part in a search and destroy operation deep in a region called War Zone D, just north of Saigon. The area was believed to hold Viet Cong fighters, but no one knew how many. It was called Operation Hump. The goal was to push further into enemy territory, cross the hill, get over the hump, as the general said, and break the enemy's control in that region. The soldiers loaded into helicopters, their faces serious, their packs heavy. They were dropped into small clearings in the middle of nowhere. Tall grass and thick trees surrounded them. Once the choppers flew off, all they had was each other. For 2 days they moved through the jungle. It was quiet, too quiet. They saw signs of the enemy. Footprints, empty camps, cooking fires still warm. But no people, no gunfire, no voices. It was like ghosts had just passed through. Some of the men joked to break the silence. Others felt the knot tightening in their stomachs. They knew something was wrong. Still, orders were orders. They kept moving. On the morning of November 8th, the 1st Battalion was told to climb a small ridge near a place called Hill 65. They didn't know it yet, but the ridge was a trap. Viet Cong fighters had spent days preparing for this moment, digging bunkers, hiding weapons, waiting for the right time. That time had come. The men of the 173rd were walking straight into a nightmare, and there was no turning back. The jungle was thick with silence as Alpha Company made its way up the ridge. It was early morning, November 8th. The soldiers of the 173rd Airborne were tired, sweating, and on edge. The climb was steep, the undergrowth heavy. Vines grabbed at their boots. Leeches clung to their skin. Their shirts were soaked through. Each man watched the trees, waiting for something, anything to move. They didn't know it, but they were being watched. All around them in hidden bunkers and spider holes, the Viet Cong 271st Regiment waited. These weren't just farmers with rifles. They were well-trained guerrilla fighters who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. They knew the terrain. They knew the patterns. and they knew exactly where the Americans would walk. Alpha Company was walking straight into a trap. At first, nothing. Just the sound of boots in wet grass, the buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Some of the soldiers were beginning to relax. Others stayed quiet, rifles ready. Then, a single shot cracked from the tree line. Then a burst. Then all hell broke loose. Machine guns opened up from the front, left, and right. Mortars began dropping behind them, cutting off the path they had come from. The ridge became a storm of bullets, explosions, smoke, and screams. It was an L-shaped ambush, a deadly setup where the enemy traps a unit in a narrow zone and hits them from multiple sides. There was no cover, no easy way out. The trees exploded with gunfire. Men were hit and went down where they stood. Some soldiers dove for the ground, firing blindly into the green wall in front of them. Others couldn't even see where the enemy was. The Viet Cong were invisible, buried, camouflaged, and deadly. Commanders tried to regroup, but radios were jammed with noise. Orders were shouted over gunfire. Squad leaders were shot. Medics crawled from man to man, dragging the wounded behind logs or into craters. The fighting was close, sometimes no more than 5 or 10 feet between the enemy and the Americans. It wasn't like the movies. It was fast, brutal, up close. One soldier later said, "You didn't fight to win. You fought to stay alive one more minute." The enemy used everything: grenades, mortars, automatic rifles. Some soldiers fought back until their ammo ran out. Then they picked up rifles from fallen friends and kept going. Alpha Company was surrounded. Some groups were completely cut off, alone in the trees, hearing nothing but the sounds of battle and not knowing who was alive. The enemy was trying to break them down piece by piece. And then the enemy started getting closer. They began moving through the jungle toward the wounded. American soldiers who couldn't move lay still and listened to footsteps crunching leaves nearby. Some pretended to be dead. Others raised their rifles and waited until the last second. In the middle of all this, a young medic named Lawrence Joel crawled through the gunfire. We'll tell his full story in the next chapter. But even now, as bullets zipped past and grenades exploded around him, Joel kept going, patching wounds, dragging men to safety, giving hope where there wasn't any. As the hours passed, the situation grew worse. Some soldiers were down to their last magazine. Blood soaked the ground. The heat and smoke made it hard to breathe. Still, they held. Some men from Bravo and Charlie companies tried to reach them. They had heard the gunfire and knew something was wrong. But when they moved up the hill, they were ambushed too. The enemy had prepared secondary traps. Another wall of gunfire pinned them down. More men fell, but they kept moving forward. They knew their brothers were dying up there. It wasn't just courage, it was duty. They would not leave each other behind. At last, after hours of hell, the radio finally broke through. Artillery was called in. Coordinates were shouted over static. Within minutes, the jungle began to shake as American shells screamed in from miles away. The trees exploded. Bunkers collapsed. The Viet Cong finally began to pull back, but not in panic. They had done what they came to do. American planes roared overhead. Jets dropped napalm, tearing into the jungle canopy. Helicopter gunships fired down into suspected enemy positions. Smoke covered the ridge. The screams quieted. The battle began to slow. By evening, the worst of the ambush was over. The survivors gathered the wounded. They moved carefully, checking every shadow, every tree, every hole in the ground. The enemy was gone, but they had left behind something far worse than fear. The ground was covered in blood. Helmets lay empty, rifles broken, trees shattered. They had made it through the ambush, but not all of them. Some men cried, others just stared into the distance. Shock, exhaustion, silence. The jungle had swallowed many of their friends, and it would never give them back. One soldier walked the ridge and said quietly, "This place, it's never going to leave me." In the middle of all the chaos, bullets, explosions, screaming, one man kept moving forward. Specialist 5 Lawrence Joel wasn't carrying a rifle. He wasn't a squad leader or a machine gunner. He was a medic. His job was to save lives. But that day on that ridge, he became something much more. When the ambush hit, Joel was right in the middle of Alpha Company. Soldiers were dropping all around him. The jungle exploded. Men cried out for help. Blood soaked the ground. And instead of hiding, Joel ran toward the screams. He didn't think about cover. He didn't wait for orders. He crawled to the first wounded man and began treating him under heavy fire. Then he moved to the next, then another. Bullets snapped past his head. Trees splintered. Mortars hit nearby, shaking the earth. Then Joel was hit. A bullet tore through his leg. He fell hard, but he didn't stop. He tied a bandage around his own leg, grabbed his bag, and kept going, dragging himself forward with one leg, still treating the wounded. He was shot again, this time in the thigh. More pain, more blood. But still, he refused to stop. At one point, a sergeant ordered. Joel looked up and said simply, "I've got to get to my men." He would go on to treat over a dozen soldiers during the battle. Many of them likely would have died without him. He gave them morphine. He wrapped their wounds. He talked to them. He kept them calm. He gave them hope when everything else was falling apart. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, Joel was still there, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. For what he did on that ridge, Lawrence Joel was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the first Black American to receive the medal while still alive since the Spanish-American War. But if you had asked him, he would have said he was just doing his job. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, the ridge was still shaking with gunfire. The soldiers of Alpha Company were barely holding on. They were scattered, pinned down, low on ammo, and surrounded. Some had been fighting for hours without rest. Others had not even had time to think, only react. They weren't alone anymore. Soldiers from Bravo and Charlie companies had moved in from the south, trying to reach them. But the Viet Cong had planned for that too. New ambushes were set along the trails. Reinforcements walked straight into more gunfire, more traps, more explosions. But they didn't stop. They knew their brothers needed them. In some parts of the jungle, fighting was happening just feet apart. American soldiers and Viet Cong were on opposite sides of the same tree. Grenades were thrown over logs. Smoke and dirt clouded the air. Shouts of "Medic!" echoed through the trees. Wounded men refused to leave the fight. Some crawled to new positions and kept shooting. Others stayed with the injured, using their bodies as shields. Every man on that ridge had a choice: run, freeze, or fight, and almost all of them fought. By late afternoon, American commanders finally broke through the radio chaos. They called in artillery strikes from nearby fire bases. The explosions came fast, shaking the ground and ripping apart the jungle. Then came the planes. American jets and helicopters flying low, dropping bombs and firing into the treetops. The firepower was massive. Trees were blown apart. Bunkers collapsed. The sky was dark with smoke. The sound was deafening. But even with all of it, the enemy held for a while longer. They were dug in deep, and they knew the land. They had been fighting like this for years. Finally, as night fell, the gunfire began to slow. One by one, the enemy slipped away into the shadows. They carried their wounded. They left behind only shell casings and blood. The Americans didn't cheer. There was no victory in their eyes, only exhaustion, relief, and sorrow. They had survived the ambush, but they all knew they wouldn't be the same after that day. When the shooting stopped, the jungle went quiet again. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was heavy, full of smoke, blood, and sorrow. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Trees stood shattered. The ground was torn open. Leaves were black with ash. The survivors of the 173rd Airborne looked around and took in what had just happened. Bodies lay scattered across the ridge. Some were their friends. Others were men they had only met days before. Helmets lay in the dirt. Rifles sat where they were dropped. Bandages stained with blood marked the paths where medics had worked. Some soldiers sat in silence, staring at the ground. Others cried quietly, too tired to hold it in. A few walked slowly between the fallen, checking for signs of life, still hoping someone might move, or breathe, or open their eyes. The medics did what they could. They kept working, even when their hands were shaking. Wounded men were lifted onto stretchers and carried to helicopters. Others were comforted with whatever words could be found. No one was the same. The battle was over, but the cost could be seen in every face, every limp, every quiet stare into the trees. The ridge they had fought for was just a hill, but to those men, it had become a place of pain and memory. Commanders said the mission was a success. They said the enemy had been pushed back, that the Americans had stood their ground. But the soldiers didn't think about success. They thought about the friends they had lost, about how quickly everything had changed. Some of them had never fired a shot in combat before that day. Now they had seen what real war looked like, up close and personal. And even after the helicopters took them off that ridge, a part of them stayed behind. They would never forget the sounds, the smells, the look in a wounded man's eyes, the way the jungle swallowed everything when the sun went down. Operation Hump was over, but for the men who were there, the battle would stay with them for the rest of their lives. What happened on that ridge in Vietnam wasn't just another battle. For the men of the 173rd Airborne, Operation Hump became a moment that changed everything. It tested their strength, their loyalty, and their will to survive. It showed the world what young soldiers could do when they refused to give up, even when the odds were against them. It also showed how brutal and unforgiving the Vietnam War could be. Many who fought there came home with scars, some on the outside, many on the inside. The memories stayed with them, the faces of the friends they lost, the sound of gunfire in the trees, the feeling of crawling through mud to save someone, or being saved by someone else. But out of the horror came stories of real courage. Like the story of Lawrence Joel, the medic who wouldn't stop. His bravery inspired others, and his actions saved lives. He became the first Black American to receive the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War, and one of the most respected heroes of his generation. The story of Operation Hump reminds us that history is not just dates and numbers. It's about people, young men thrown into impossible situations who stood their ground, who fought for each other, and who paid a heavy price for it. Even today, decades later, the veterans who survived still remember. And those who didn't make it home are honored not just by medals or books, but by the stories we tell. Because as long as we remember them, they're never truly gone. Thank you for watching this story about Operation Hump and the brave soldiers of the 173rd Airborne. If this moved you, if it made you think, or if you learned something new, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share powerful, true stories from history that deserve to be remembered. There are many more battles, forgotten heroes, and moments of courage we'll be covering. Until next time, take care and remember, behind every war story are real people who lived it.